Hello, dear friends. I've been requested to talk about jobs and unemployment. Now, we know that unemployment is technically at 4%, which is really low compared to what it has been in the past, as well as the fact that the labor participation rate has also slightly recovered after the end of the COVID pandemic, which is not yet declared as having ended, but is rapidly coming to an end. We know a lot of people have become jobless in this process due to the vaccine mandates, and that's a big concern. But there are broad trends, and I want to talk about the broad trends today, and also highlight the fact. So there's a lot of expectation among people that the government should be doing, should be creating jobs. They actually want jobs to be created by the government. That's not the way it works. The government is our servant. It's got to do a particular set of jobs, and those jobs inside the government are essentially what it can create. But we know that jobs within the government are unfortunately they're just too many. They've created too many jobs in the government in most parts of the government across Australia. We have a very heavy duty government system, a lot of taxes, and that's where we probably need to cut these jobs down a little bit at least. There's a lot of unnecessary functions that the government performs. That is one of my concerns I had when I was in the Department of Treasury and Finance that we continue to have so many unnecessary functions performed by the government, and once those things are reduced, very targeted and strategically. I'm not recommending slash and burn kind of a policy for the government jobs. But if we are targeted and we flush out things that are really unnecessary, which is very hard, as we all know, because people will always justify their jobs inside the government. But once we do that, we probably can get a little bit of money back into the pockets of the people who actually then create jobs by the demand that they have for various goods and services. There is another set of jobs that the government is expected to create, and that's the jobs in infrastructure. Now, we obviously need infrastructure. I won't go into details today, but it's a very big issue, and we need to have more infrastructure in most cases because it facilitates interaction and transactions, and therefore our productivity as a society. There are a few pieces of infrastructure that are excessive, but that's where the cost-benefit analysis comes. Nevertheless, there is a continuous set of jobs in a growing economy in the field of infrastructure, both in terms of construction and maintenance. So that's a set of jobs that is in infrastructure. But the point I wanted to sort of highlight, and I've mentioned in many other places in the past, that it's not necessarily the job of the government to create infrastructure. That is, I give examples of water supply, for example, in England, in London. It's been completely owned by the private sector, different companies managing the the water supply system in London for hundreds of years. Rural roads in France, mostly in the private sector. They got toll roads and other such, things going on there in the private sector. They build them and maintain them privately in the rural areas of France. And we know that the trains of Japan were privatized and transformed from being pretty shabby and never in time into being, the most efficient train system in the world. So one of the best ways to get good infrastructure is to actually let the private sector do it. What we need to do is to hand over certain property rights to them, maybe in the form of a long-term lease or various contractual arrangements by which the private sector will then become free and emboldened to create what is called the public goods that these represent. It's very important to remember that public goods does not mean that these are provided by the government. They are meant for the public to use, and if there is a way to put boundaries across them in some form or the other, through toll roads or through other such methods, and this is possible virtually in all cases, then the infrastructure should be built and handed over to the private sector. The other one is, of course, yes, borrowing is a good thing. Because infrastructure is supposed to be productive and it's supposed to pass the cost benefit test, I expect that a good infrastructure is pays for itself over the course of time, and so the government can borrow for this purpose and potentially should borrow, and that I have no issues with that kind of a job creation system where the government borrows money, where the private sector borrows money for infrastructure because it's been handed over to the private sector. So the combination of the public and private sector infrastructure is the way to go forward. And what we need is essentially high quality infrastructure, which means high quality, productive jobs in these areas. The other part, which is private sector jobs, that's where the economy really works. The economy produces. The government doesn't produce anything. Infrastructure is only a facilitating function, and also the government's function is largely facilitative. But for the private sector to be able to produce, we need these two things. We need a good, effective government system, which facilitates our lives, rule of law, and everything else. And we need infrastructure. So these two things of the government are in that sense, they're productive. We need to consider that the government is not totally useless. It performs a very valuable function. But in terms of the economy, the wealth is created by the private sector. All the taxes are ultimately paid for by the private sector. The government takes the money from the people, but it doesn't produce that wealth. That wealth and income is produced by the private sector. So we need to have productive jobs in the economy which pay for themselves. We need to have profit-making companies, and that's only possible if we have an optimally functioning market system. The free market system must be given full rein. It must be allowed to operate as freely as possible with minimal set of restrictions. And the main thing the government can do in this case is to get out of the way of the private sector. The government departments today, as far as I'm aware, and I've worked for many, many years in the government, they are flooded with people with ideological beliefs and who want to dabble with the market at every step. Everything to them looks like a market failure, and they create an excuse to, first of all, grow their own empire. They hire a lot of more people because they have a project which they want to fiddle with everything. And then they go and create restrictions and rules for the private sector. And if sometimes, you consider what's going on with the private sector in terms of the rules, the very act of reading the rules itself can consume, massive amount of time of the business. And so that's really very unproductive. Consider the COVID example. It's a very good example. You're familiar with it right now. The government has been pumping out public health orders, which are in the range of 70, 80 pages long. And they've been pumped out non-stop along with other sets of orders, etc. And I can guarantee that they're meant for the people of Australia to read, the people of Victoria, etc. And they are meant for the businesses to read all the time and to understand. But imagine the amount of time that's been required to be spent to even read those orders and understand what are the requirements today. Requirements changed very rapidly from time to time. And so this kind of randomness, which is part of the system of government, which, they dabble too much, they impose opinions too many on too many things, they restrict business, they also effectively confiscate private property rights of the business in terms of occupational rights and so on. They do licensing and all sorts of other dabbling, which is not the way to go. There is as many better ways to get the results for the society than what's currently happening. So get out of the way is a simple thing. I'll come to that in a second, how to get out of the way. But consider that special economic zone concept, that once the whole of Australia is considered as a special economic zone, that means there are the very minimal laws operating. Then investors come from all over the world and invest in the country. And that's what you need to do. We need to have investment flowing into Australia from all over the world, because Australia does not impose unnecessary restrictions and high taxes. So that's another part of the story I've not mentioned here in the slide, but that's keeping the taxes low. And how do you keep taxes low? By cutting down the jobs, unnecessary jobs inside the government. That is the one sector which has grown too big in Australia and needs to really be, tidied up. Then the final slide I've got here is to discuss the specific issues today. We've had 2 years of disruptions, man-made disruptions, the chaos, the lies, and the totalitarianism, and randomness in the orders, continuous changing things, burning money in hundreds of billions of dollars destroyed, supply chains blocked by the government. These two parties, Liberal Labour parties, as I've discussed earlier, have completely disrupted Australia over the last 2 years through the most ridiculous policies that they could possibly adopt for a virus which is 50 to 500 times less lethal than Spanish flu. Moreover, and here's the interesting part, I should probably mention it quickly, that I've discovered that the difference, we can't even compare with Spanish flu for a simple reason that in the Spanish flu, it was the youth who were dying, and so the years of life lost in the Spanish flu was not just 50 to 500 times bigger, it was potentially 10,000 times bigger, or 5 to 10,000 times bigger. So we've got studies which show that in Australia, the average person who died from COVID lost 2.7 years of life. Now, this might sound really small, but that's a full-fledged peer-reviewed study including by authors from Monash University, Deakin University, etc. And so that's fairly authentic. Okay, so we're looking at 2.7 years of life lost through the COVID pandemic for the average person, and that's because it's overwhelmingly the elderly who died. And they would have died otherwise. But if you consider the Spanish flu, where we say it was 50 to 100 times more lethal, but these guys told us it is equal to Spanish flu, this particular thing, COVID, which is nonsense. But if we were to compare that, you realize that that's actually, it was killing the youth in vast numbers. So youth were losing anywhere from 50 to 60 years of life in comparison. And so when you compare 2.7 years of life lost versus 60 years of life lost, you can just see how radically the calculation changes. And so I would, I'm not estimating the number right now, but it can be clearly well into 5 to 10,000 times less lethal than the Spanish flu. That's the correct way to look at it after controlling for the years of life lost. So for a thing which was 10,000 times less lethal than the Spanish flu, these fellows, the Liberal Labour Party guys, have destroyed Australia. And one of the things they've done was to destroy jobs in hospitality, tourism. And then what happened is, since jobs were lost, the youth had to reskill for other jobs. And now they're not necessarily trained enough for these jobs. The second was a lot of normal training and experience got disrupted. So people aren't getting jobs now easily because they don't have the experience. And the employers want experience. And how did they get the experience? They can't do it when the whole country is shut down. And of course, there were a lot of older people who left the workforce. And I'm one of them. For example, I just resigned. I was sick of this whole nonsense that's going on and the beating up of everybody, etc. The police state, the totalitarianism. And I wanted to rebel, and I did that. But then I have to get back to my job one day and then, earn a living. So these are the disruptions. And we know, the other issue we know is that although the jobs are coming back, a lot of jobs are coming back, they're not necessarily in the area where people have trained for. And some of the areas that they were involved with, they've lost the skills. So it's a kind of a mismatch going on because of this massive disruption. Okay, so we also have factories that were not adequately productive, and so supply chain issues everywhere, and so on. So overall, the job matching has become worse over the last 2 years. How do we solve this problem? It's not going to be solved there's no magic bullet for it, unfortunately, but there is what is called sensible policy that the Federation Party would be implementing, and that would include mainly investment facilitation through reduced regulation. As I mentioned, let the whole of Australia be a special economic zone. Let there be also what is called semi-private cities and so on, where basically you hand over the entire area, a large area of land to the private sector on long-term lease. They build their own infrastructure. They have their own zoning laws if they require it. Basically, the state's laws don't apply. The restrictions imposed on high density, this rule, that rule doesn't apply. Some environmental rules apply. And with that, what would happen is we'd have a large number of these semi-private cities that actually become the hubs of modern technology, innovation, etc. And they will also be the ones that produce a lot more goods for Australia, because they would be the industries would be located close to where people live, and so it would become more productive in every way. And we'd also reduce our supply chain issues. So once we have the semi-private cities and we also have less regulation, Australia will attract investment from all over the world, and will become self-sufficient in terms of not necessarily in all regards, but self-sufficient to a large extent in production. And the supply chain issues will also come down, and jobs obviously will be created in vast quantities in this process. We need, obviously, the productivity enhancing microeconomic reforms and competition reforms. I won't go into details here, but those are needed in case we want to get people higher paying jobs, because unless people become more productive, they're not going to get paid more. Okay, so it's basically to get higher wages will need to be more productive. Therefore, the government has to have productivity enhancing microeconomic reforms and competition reforms. And the other one, I have a message for the youth who are struggling at the moment in terms of a good match for their jobs, is that this is definitely something the world is moving quite clearly towards. It's moving away from the old economy to a new economy where there's a lot of information technology, artificial intelligence, robotics, and so on. And so it's necessary for everyone to become familiar with these things and to skill themselves up in these areas. And it doesn't necessarily mean getting formal training, directly learning these things from YouTube and other MOOCs or whatever they call these lectures from various universities, which are almost free of cost in many cases. That's the way to go, to skill every young person, to skill themselves up so that they upgrade their suitability for the rapidly changing job market. There are predictions that the job market will become more and more focused on these information technology areas. So it's really important for people, young people particularly, to get more familiar with these things. And if that happens, then in the next 1 or 2 years, they should find good jobs, well-paying jobs. And if the AFP policies, as I mentioned, investment facilitation, semi-private cities, microeconomic reform, competition reform, skills reform, if all these are done, then definitely we'll have not just more jobs, better paying jobs, and well matched to the skills of the youth. So that's, I thought, a summary of what I think about the jobs issue today. And please send me questions at sabhlok@gmail.com, and I'll try to respond when I have some time. Thank you very much.